Welcome to the Chaos Sector. We return to the Matrix. Bear with us this episode. It's going to be a long one. Please have patience. The Democratic Convention will mark the first time in more than 50 years that a major party nominee was selected outside of the democratic process of primaries and caucuses. Old Joe stepped down as the Democratic candidate and chose his vice president as the nominee. Okay, now this is where the trouble begins. Well, it started 3.5 years ago, to be honest. But Old Joe stated he was not running for re-election because he wanted a new generation of Democrats to carry the party into the future. Blah, blah, blah. Here's the problem. The previous debates between Trump and Old Joe were earlier than any other presidential debate in U.S. history. This was on June 27. And because the presidential debates were earlier, of course, the primaries were earlier as well. Which leads us to the question here. If Harris doesn't have to debate her fellow Democrats like Old Joe did in the primaries, well, what's the point of having a convention then? It is in the convention where delegates of all types attend the convention and cast their votes to choose the party's presidential candidate. But those delegates are sort of forced to choose Harris because Old Joe had ran the table in the primaries, right? So he was the nominee for the party. But if there was no primary for Harris, yet she is the nominee, how did she obtain this nomination without a primary? Talking in circles here, of course. Again, just because Old Joe nominated her and he was the former nominee, it doesn't work that way. The voters and delegates backed his nomination, yet the voters and the delegates never had the opportunity to determine if Harris was worthy of their nomination. If this sounds like some funny business, such as election fraud, well, it is. But there are some corners they cut to make it appear perfectly normal. The president and the vice president share campaign funds, so Harris obtaining those funds as the nominee, there's no problem there. But it's the reason behind it that creates the theory that this was a Democratic coup against Old Joe. If Old Joe had fallen ill, like they say he did, and by the way, that makes it worse. They reported that Old Joe was infected by the clover virus, that's our nickname. If he was infected with the clover virus, in addition to his age, why didn't Nancy Pelosi and all the other wackos enforce the 25th Amendment? Yeah, there were reports that they threatened to enforce it due to his horrible debate performance, but not due to his health. I mean, essentially, the 25th Amendment centers around that specific reason. The vice president takes over if the president has a disability, passes away, resigns, or is removed from office through impeachment. Old Joe has been mumbling and fumbling all over the place, falling on the stairs onto Air Force One, falling at a ceremony, falling off his bicycle, loses his train of thought. He should have made the decision to not run for re-election a long time ago. It was clear that he was physically incapable, which is basically a disability by definition. Then you have his mental state, which was also a disability by definition. But Nancy Pelosi wanted to see if he could beat Trump. That's all she cared about. Never mind the fact that you had a senior citizen incapable of riding a bike, for fuck's sake. They were willing to allow Old Joe to be humiliated on a daily basis as long as he could complete the task given to him. He mysteriously accomplished this task in 2020, keyword, mysteriously. But over the past 3.5 years, the American people realized that he had nothing to do with that. But he waited till after he had won the primaries, which made him the lock for the Democrat nominee for president. And in doing so, it allowed Harris, the vice president, to basically leapfrog every other Democrat as well, and now she inherits that nomination in this absurd procedure that took place. We don't focus on the campaign funds transferred over to her because the money can't help you on the debate stage, well, sort of. We focus on how the plan was to sneak Harris into that position to run for president. Remember, Old Joe never stated that he was too old to continue to be president. No, he wouldn't say that. He just said he's not running for re-election. Now this basically is the same thing, but dealing with election rules, the Constitution and such, saying you're too old to continue as president changes the entire Democratic Party and their decisions going forward. This is a mess. They're all over the damn place. We see the difference in both parties. Republicans are basically supporting Trump. He's the candidate. Although some don't agree, they're outnumbered. On the other hand, you have Democrats who have a current president who has decided not to run for re-election after obtaining the nomination, already had presidential debates, and fell on his face and decides to endorse his vice president as the nominee, who hasn't received not one single vote, nor a debate with her fellow Democrats in the primaries. And the delegates that supported Old Joe have to make a decision if they will nominate her as the presidential candidate in the Democratic convention coming up. It's like a party with no structure, just plugging in random people to meet a deadline. Well, to be honest, that's what they did with Old Joe. We have placeholder candidates. They are used solely to defeat Donald Trump, not Republicans, you see. When Trump came around, Democrats literally left policies behind and focused mainly on just, well, keeping him out of office. Old Joe was the stubborn grandpa figure who was used as the tough challenger against the orange tyrant. It worked from an optical perspective. Yet Old Joe was not running on his moderate policies, and this became more and more evident the more he spoke. He was pushing someone else's policies, and it got exposed early on in their 2020 presidential debates. Fast forward to Old Joe's administration, and it was clear to every American citizen, including the global audience, that he literally was in the basement the entire time. This could have all been avoided if Old Joe had stepped down as president. But see, that's where the major problem lies. Harris as president at this moment would definitely destroy the image of Harris for president in the future. For example, let's say Old Joe had made his decision prior to the Democratic primaries, and Harris essentially would take his place. Her record would once again be challenged, similar to how Tulsi Gabbard blasted her on live television in their previous debate. And it would be even more absurd, because you would have the same scenario then as now. A lame duck as president who is not running for re-election, and a vice president who took his place essentially as president, but was exposed in the primaries against other Democrats. And that would make her vice presidency even more scary, because she is in the position of becoming the president with those wacky far-left policies. Mind you, she was rated the most liberal senator in 2020, further left than Bernie Sanders. This is the same person as vice president. How did she get there? Ask Latasha Brown of Black Votes Matter. They snuck her in through the back door, my friends. It's clear to see. And as we've said, and we'll say it again, this is why your votes mean absolutely nothing. They are forcing citizens who vote Democrat to vote for Kamala Harris. It's exactly what happened with Old Joe. Since those Democrats despise Republicans, especially Trump, they will fold under the pressure and vote for Harris, even if they don't like her, to spite the political opposition. Yet, there's a lot of rumbling in the black community about Harris. And get this, even Black Lives Matter came out and denounced her. What? Are you kidding me? I think it's reverse psychology, to be honest. Behind closed doors, they're up to something. And it's in favor of Harris. But the mainstream media is trying their best to silence the voices of many black people who do not support or approve of Harris as the Democratic candidate. What we have here is a rigged presidential election, again. It's gonna happen. Because the Democrats can't allow Harris to lose to Trump after she has been celebrated like the second coming of Obama. They rigged the primaries for Old Joe. He lost his mind literally in the presidential debates against Trump. Approval rating dropped faster than his cognition. The Democrat elites knew that was a clear path to victory for Trump, and they told him to not run for re-election. But he already did. Remember, they already had the presidential debates. You can't drop out after losing the debates and your approval rating nosedived. You have to own it, fight through it, right? Things could change at that point. You would have approximately 3 to 4 months to improve on that. But it wasn't his decision. It was the wackos behind him who pulled the plug. And again, this wasn't due to his mental and physical state, according to the reports. We know it was, though, but Pelosi and other House Democrats knew it was over. You can't pull the Democratic presidential candidate because you feared he would lose the presidential election. That's how the cookie crumbles for the loser, right? But no, Pelosi and Schumer said, nope, we're taking you out of the race because you're going to lose to Trump come November. Here's the problem. They did this while he was president. He had already won the primaries, gained the majority of delegates. He was the nominee, but they held those presidential debates earlier than usual. So they were allotted the time to pull the plug on Old Joe as the schedule was earlier, which allowed for them to slither in Harris as the Democratic nominee with many months to go before November. Another question raised here. If Old Joe already had his presidential debates in June against Trump, as he was the Democratic nominee, Harris will also have her presidential debates against Trump in the near future? When's the last time you had two candidates hold presidential debates in the same election year and against the same person? This has never happened in the history of US politics. Well, perhaps there's an example way back where elections were a bit more cavalier. But in modern history, there has never been two nominees selected and both presidential candidates for their party and have presidential debates all in the same year. This is insanity. Right up the Democrats' alley, though. Elizabeth Warren said it, Donna Brazile said it. The Democrats are used to rigging their elections. If the candidate is chosen and they start to crumble in the polls, that's the candidate that was chosen. Live with it. You can't rig things in your favor because you fear the outcome. And you wouldn't have these problems if you were genuine and your candidates chosen reflected that. So everything was flipped upside down. What he was supposed to do was actually step down as president after that horrible performance. That would have been the sincere thing to do. But what do you expect with corrupt politicians? So now we have a glitch in the political matrix. And well, that's what happens when your central processing unit is starting to die on you. Now here's that infamous black cat strolling through the room in the matrix. In other words, there is something off. If old Joe lost support among black voters over the last 3 years due to not accomplishing what he promised, and Harris was his vice president, how does Harris gain in this area if she was a part of that same administration that didn't accomplish anything neither? I mean, think about it. She was horrible on the border. She advocates for abortion. Harris has locked up thousands of black men for nonviolent crimes. She hasn't proposed anything for the black community specifically. And let me also mention the optics of Harris in public. In a recent rally in Atlanta, Harris had many celebrities performing for the crowd. Now, one of those performers was Megan Thee Stallion. First, I want to say that celebrities have the right to endorse presidential candidates. That's fine. But the problem here is the message. I'm not going to sugarcoat this analysis. We need to tell the truth. Megan Thee Stallion performed her hit songs, which were related to sex, promiscuity, money, and materialism. She had to edit the songs to be, quote, family friendly. Throughout these performances, Megan Thee Stallion and her dancers are twerking frequently in those performances. Now, at face value, the performances are not much of a problem. She's an entertainer. But again, the message isn't there. As a female rapper who is endorsing Kamala Harris, which is essentially depicted as black woman empowerment, wouldn't it have been better for Megan Thee Stallion to write new material related to Harris's presidential campaign? That would truly be empowering. But if you are performing songs that are the complete opposite of empowerment, what message does this send to the crowd? What message does it send young black women and young black girls who are in attendance? And more so, what message does it send America in relation to Harris' approval of these performances? Harris for president is the slogan, right? She would make history as the first colored woman as president, right? Now, in context, Megan Thee Stallion is endorsing this message in the rally by performing her raunchy material as a rap artist. But it's not only irrelevant to the purpose of the rally, it's also, quote, politically and culturally inappropriate. It's not just entertainment. There has to be a motivating factor of that performance at the rally to, well, rally everyone together for Harris for president. That's the whole point of the rally. True students of the craft, being rap and hip-hop, would decide to tone it down a bit and take that moment to spread positivity through a positive message, not compound the same stereotype of black women in the music industry as being sex dolls. That's another topic, of course. We'll get into that in the future. Many on social media have condemned this behavior as being just another example of black women promoting sex, money, and materialism. Instead of having a female rapper such as Jean Grey, who is a thought-provoking and social political artist, they would rather have a self-proclaimed, quote, ratchet rapper in Megan Thee Stallion and her twerking entourage. There are several female rappers who would have made that rally much more meaningful. Artists like Eve, Da Brat, MC Lyte, Missy Elliott, more diverse female rappers who are not centered in sexuality. Now, some may say, oh, those artists are outdated. That's the whole point. They're older, they're more mature, and they present themselves with class. And because they are not depicted as sex dolls, the message behind their performances align with Harris' message for her presidential campaign. It sends the wrong message, and that was the intention. See, you can tell a lot about a person based on the type of music they listen to or promote. Harris could have suggested Megan Thee Stallion write a song about her journey, her career, her accomplishments, and her goals. And she wouldn't have had to clean up the dirty versions of her songs to be family friendly. The new song would be family friendly. She's a talented rapper, right? She should be able to write that song within 24 hours, especially if she's given a biography of Harris, right? But if Harris herself does not truly take her presidential campaign seriously, the artists she approves to perform at her rallies will be nothing more than entertainment, not empowering.
And then there's the guest appearance on RuPaul's Drag Queen show. I mean, it's justifying the same radical and far-left liberalism that many have revealed about her. Drag queens are human beings as well. They have rights, politically and socially. That's a different issue. But there's a reason why the left aligns with these communities more than the right. It's the very liberal ideologies that they both share. And although there isn't a criticism of drag queens directly here, it's the optics of the message Harris is sending. Mind you, Harris is from San Francisco, a city riddled with homelessness, drug addiction, and far-left ideology. And it is in fact slated the LGBTQ capital of the country. Controversy had came about regarding drag queens having story time in elementaries. And the scary thing about this issue is the parents are not notified and aren't even asked if they consent to their children being exposed to these activities. Now, when this came about, Harris was still representing San Francisco in Congress as Senator of California, meaning she was aware of this, and since she didn't pose this problematic issue to her constituents, it proves that Harris's record of being the most liberal senator rings true. And all of this that I have broken down does not, I repeat, does not align with the Black community's culture as a whole, from older individuals and Black men. The target group is in fact Gen Z, who are easily influenced by liberal ideology because they are searching for freedom of expression in society. That's the target group. But it only magnifies her record of being ultra-liberal, which she is attempting to disavow currently. In her first year in the Senate, she co-sponsored legislation of far-left socialist Bernie Sanders proposing Medicare for all. But now she has changed her tune and no longer supports that single-payer healthcare system. So that's one socialist policy she once supported and now has rejected. Then you had police funding, which she supported the defund the police movement, which it's reported to redirect funds from law enforcement to social services. Now, watch how we catch her and her fellow wacky Democrats in a jam. So the claims are that Harris didn't mean that there shouldn't be police in those lower class communities, more so that there should be more comprehensive strategies on how to keep the community safe. But the claim that funds should be redirected to social services. How about take the billions of dollars out of the Inflation Reduction Act that you and old Joe passed and redirect those funds to social services? $783 billion to climate change? $80 billion to hire over 80,000 new IRS employees? That's almost an average of $1 billion per hire. Are you kidding me? So the truth of the matter was, within those circles, she called to defund the police. But when many cities were decimated by riots and arson, she now tries to walk back that view because it's a bad image for a presidential candidate to call to defund the police. You lose the support of the men and women who serve this country as police officers, and you also lose the support from the military and the families of those individuals as well. So of course, to save face, although it's virtually impossible to do so, Harris tries to support law enforcement for her presidential campaign. And last but definitely not least, border control. Harris supported a bipartisan bill that would have ramped up enforcement at the border. Yet, her actions spoke louder than her alleged support. As vice president, who was assigned to oversee the border, as the border czar, Harris was not active in physically visiting the border, nor was she active in speaking publicly about the border crisis. And Harris compared the ICE agents, get this, compared them to the KKK. Now we provide the context of that, of course. Ronald Vitiello had described the Democratic Party as liberal-cratic and neo-Klanists. And Harris responded in saying that some perceive the ICE agency as the KKK, as immigrants are separated from their families and such. Quote, speaking during a November 2018 confirmation hearing for Ron Vitiello to be the next ICE director, then Senator Harris took umbrage with Vitiello's past statements, calling the Democratic Party liberal-cratic and neo-Klanists. In her exchange with Vitiello about the tactics of the KKK, she asked him if he saw any parallels between ICE and the white supremacist organization, unquote. But here's how we know that claim is a lie, and it was a slick way for her to call ICE the KKK. This was in 2018, which was during the Trump administration, right? Okay, now prior to the Trump administration, you had the Obama administration, including Old Joe as vice president. Obama deported more illegal immigrants in his first year than Trump in his entire term. But there was no perception of the ICE agency being the KKK. That's one contradiction. Then, in the current administration, Old Joe claimed to have done his share of deporting illegal immigrants as well. But the ICE agency is not considered the KKK by whomever Harris claims stated that. Simply put, they're deemed white supremacist under the Trump administration, by Harris's perception, not from anyone else. And she is fabricating incidents where migrants, legal and illegal, compared ICE to the KKK, so she can slander them in that hearing. So if she stated this about the agents that are working hard to protect the borders and keep criminals out of the country, what merit does her so-called supporting a bipartisan bill to ramp up enforcement at the border have if you're comparing that same enforcement to the KKK? Once again, saying things in the comfort of the Democratic bubble and also in the shadows as vice president. But once you take center stage as a presidential candidate, it's like you never made that statement. Oh, okay. This is absolutely madness.
Mind you, all of the executive orders Old Joe signed in the first 100 days were mainly for illegal immigrants. Harris was standing right beside him when all of these orders were signed. So what policies does Harris propose to not only draw in black men, but the black community in general? Yet, the mainstream media is making it appear that the black community is rallying behind Harris, yet months prior had nothing positive to say about her. In fact, they had nothing really to say at all. And rewinding back, again, the black community, including black women, chose to vote for a white man over Harris as the Democratic candidate for president. In addition to that, Harris essentially alludes to that same white man who black women voted for over her was racist due to his time as a senator. And to add even more to that, she then turns around and accepts the role of being his vice president after LaTosha Brown demanded Old Joe pick a black woman as his vice president. If you're following, there's a lot of fuckery going on here. There's a bug squirming around in the matrix system, and it was spotted. Now the black cat represented, guess what? Deja vu. Meaning, this has happened before, my friends. Yes, just the players' roles were reversed, being Obama as president and Old Joe as vice president. Harris is being depicted as the female version of Obama as vice president and Old Joe as president. But it's really Harris as the president and Old Joe as the vice president. Once again, it's a bunch of political garbage. And everyone talks about the insane rhetoric of Trump, but Harris has said some crazy shit herself, like calling 18 to 24-year-olds stupid.
What's the other thing we know about this population? And it's a specific phase of life. Remember, age is more than a chronological fact. What else do we know about this population, 18 through 24? They are stupid. That is why we put them in dormitories. And they have a resident assistant. They make really bad decisions.
They make really bad decisions? I guess they have an excuse, right? But what about your bad decision, referring to them as stupid publicly as a political figure? You made a really bad decision making that statement. Now, we all know what she meant in context, but then again, it's the hot temperature of the choice of words. She could have used the term naive to describe how 18 to 24-year-olds make many mistakes in that age range. Instead, she chose a more inflammatory and controversial term in calling them stupid. Mind you, this was in 2015. So this was closer to the more, well, authentic Harris. I sense a condescending, dismissive individual who is a part of the elite class in society, who feel they can say whatever they want due to their position of power, in whatever capacity.
They are stupid.
And it's a very sensitive term because there are many youth whose parents in fact called them stupid their entire childhood, up into those young adult years. So for her to use that term instead of naive, which directly correlates to what she is explaining, it shows her language is very hostile.
They are stupid.
And if her language is hostile, then her personality is hostile. And well, the rest is self-explanatory. And that ironically will be a significant portion of her voting bloc. Great way to spit on the voters that can help you out, huh? Climate change, environmental justice, abortion, defunding the police, advocating for bailing out violent protesters, advocate for sanctuary cities, equity. All of this has done nothing for the black community. And this is because Democrats have shown they don't actually want to help one of their most loyal voting base. They just want to attack their political opposition to convince that voting base they care. It's sort of like the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Interesting take. I think that applies with that very younger generation of voters, which is the crazy part. It's by proxy. Just say the political opposition is racist, bigots, blah blah, and you gain support off that rhetoric alone. Yeah, it's just rhetoric. Many individuals have been recently asked, are they voting for Kamala Harris? They replied yes. But then they were asked, could they explain one policy Harris had that they liked, and they couldn't provide not one. So they were then asked, so what is it about Harris you support if you can't provide any of her policies? Some of them giggled in embarrassment, while others said, well, because she's in the position to be the first woman president. In other examples, a panel of black people were discussing this very issue, and a young black lady was asked, why does she support Kamala Harris? And to her credit, she was at least honest and stated because she's a black woman. I commend her for that honesty and not beating around the bush, but this is where identity politics starts to really clash with the integrity of politics, which is practically non-existent. If you vote for someone based on their gender and their race, this is how DEI starts to become a growing theory about Harris, going back to even being selected as the vice president. We've already covered that in the past, of course, but it really gives the black politicians and other people of color who are politicians the stiff rail, because they have worked so hard and are disregarded for someone who fits the political agenda. And that is linked to policy, my friends, because those non-white Democrats who are moderate, or even conservative, would be the better choice as far as policy, but it doesn't align with the insane leaders of the party, which is radically shifting to becoming a socialist party, even communist. There are plenty of Democrats who represent the party better than Kamala Harris, old Joe for that matter, but they don't have the support, or perhaps they would rather keep a sense of foundation within the party, out of the spotlight. That's commendable. But the front runners, who get the most exposure, the most support, and have the most influence, have destroyed the once balanced Democratic Party of yesterday. Yes, believe it or not, Democrats were once fairly left of center at one point. I'll say this though, if Harris will be the nominee, she will have to face one of her biggest challenges, and that's her own reflection in the mirror. In other words, everything she has proposed, advocated for, as a senator, attorney general, and as vice president, she has to convince the American people that views and policies will benefit the country. And since she's a byproduct of old Joe's administration, I think it will be revealed that it was her influence, along with other radicals, that were in charge. Harris has attempted a Houdini trick. Border czar? Oh no, I was not responsible for that. Fracking? Oh no, that's not something I approve of. In an article from the Denver Post, it highlights how Harris is, quote, calibrating her policy pitch for going to battle with Trump. Calibrating? So she's adjusting her policy pitch. So she's changing some things, right? Well, let's see. Quote, Vice President Kamala Harris is facing the delicate task of calibrating her policy pitch to American voters, a standard task for any White House hopeful, but one that comes with additional challenges this year. First, Harris is running for president while serving under President Joe Biden, meaning she's linked to anything that happened or will happen on his watch. She inherits accomplishments like limiting the cost of insulin, but also the administration's struggle to prevent illegal border crossings. Wait, the low cost of insulin was from a prior administration, that being the Trump administration. Old Joe added a few elements to it. In fact, let's go back over that for a moment, to show it was not even a primary focus of this administration. Quote, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and Joint Commit on Taxation, the law will raise $738 billion from tax reform and prescription drug reform to lower prices, as well as authorize $891 billion in total spending, including $783 billion on energy and climate change. and 3 years of Affordable Care Act subsidies. It represents the largest investment towards addressing climate change in United States history. It also includes a large expansion of the IRS, including the hiring of up to 87,000 new employees to cover tens of thousands of recent departures, unquote. Now, in this segment breaking down the Inflation Reduction Act, which old Joe passed, where is the actual spending on healthcare? We see tax reform, we see energy and climate change, and we even see the IRS. Well, here are the numbers. Addressing domestic energy security and climate change, projected spending is $783 billion. Changes to Medicare Part D, for low-income subsidies, vaccine coverage, and insulin. Yep, that's the main issue they point out. Projected spending is $44 billion. And right below that, you have increased funding for the IRS, hiring up to 87,000 new employees. Projected spending is $80 billion. So the lower cost for insulin is misleading when you crunch the numbers, because they are spending more on the IRS than the American citizens, especially the low-income communities. And it really shows where the Democrats' focus is, and it's not the American people. $783 billion projected spending on climate change? Insanity. Now, all of this old Joe and Harris signed off on, which proves that there is more concern and focus on climate change and the IRS than the American people. Harris was the vice president when this executive order was signed. She could have vetoed the bill. Yes, she had the power to do so, along with Congress members. Old Joe would be forced to not sign the bill, and it would be taken back to be adjusted, and a more comprehensive bill would be reintroduced. Yet they all went along with it, essentially throwing taxpayers' money down the drain. But what do you expect from corrupt politicians? Anywho, the general perception of both parties is Democrats love to spend and Republicans love to save. It's like parent and child here, as the Democrats gain access to their parents' credit card and are running through the shopping mall buying everything they see. Trump pointed out a key issue regarding climate change. Other countries in the Paris Agreement do not, I repeat, do not invest as much money into climate change as the United States. It's a joint effort by the world powers, so why is the United States investing the bulk into that agreement? You could cut that spending down to about a solid $400 billion, allocate the remaining $383 billion into funding for, get this, the American people. Roads, highways, communities, you name it. Then we have Medicare Part D for low-income communities, only at $44 billion, yet funding for the IRS, a government entity, receives $80 billion. Since when do you need more IRS employees? I thought it was in the best interest to shrink government, not increase it. But see, this is how the left plays the game. Larger government means more government jobs, which they use as bragging rights for a low unemployment rate. But once again, misleading. Government jobs, although they are jobs, those are not in the private sector, which makes up at least 70% of the population's employment. Yet this number is gradually decreasing annually because more government jobs are being pushed to citizens who are leaving the private sector. More government jobs means more government control, which means less power the citizen has economically. Cut that IRS funding to about $40 billion and allocate the remaining $40 billion into Medicare Part D. More money invested into Medicare, more low-income patients being covered, and receiving better quality of care due to more money being invested into that system. But you know, as the saying goes, give a Democrat a foot, they'll take acres. Quote, Harris has already disavowed some of her earlier positions, such as ban on fracking and support for single-payer healthcare. And she's pledging to keep some of Biden's promises, including tax increases on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. Wait, another misleading proposal. Over the past 5 to 10 years, government jobs have increased, so we can suggest that in context, this benefits government employees more, even though private sector employees still outnumber public sector employees. You have the Green New Deal, which are public sector jobs, and all other climate change-related employment. All of these are government jobs. Remember, they proposed $783 billion into climate change. That would create thousands, if not millions of jobs in the public sector. You understand? Quote, That means Harris's path to the White House could depend on her ability to chart a course toward the country's future, while being selective about her past. Success will mean keeping Democrats united behind her vision, while keeping the focus on Republican candidate Donald Trump's record of undermining abortion rights and his challenges to democratic traditions. Oh, of course, have to throw Trump in the equation when discussing Harris's shaky policies. Trump already established his stance on abortion. That's a 50-50 issue across the board. And democratic traditions. What about the democratic tradition of holding primaries for a candidate so the American people and delegates can choose who to vote for? That is literally an existential threat to democracy, my friends. Everything will have to happen at unprecedented speed, because Harris was abruptly thrust into the spotlight after Biden decided to drop his re-election bid a little more than a week ago. Her newly designed campaign website doesn't even include a policy section. Unquote. Well, everything will have to happen at an unprecedented speed, because Democrats executed damage control and violated the democratic tradition by pulling the party's nominee, who had already held presidential debates against Trump and was supposed to be preparing for the presidential election. But no, Democrats pulled the plug and altered this democratic tradition by abruptly thrusting Harris into the spotlight because they knew the presidential nominee was not going to beat Trump. Technically, Harris shouldn't be able to debate Trump in the presidential debates because she did not follow the get this democratic tradition of being selected the nominee by her Democratic constituents. Yeah, sure, just throw her in there without an official primary. Who cares about democracy? Utter insanity. And if I were Trump and the Republicans, I would demand that Harris go through the Democratic tradition of debating in the primaries, just to make it official that she is the nominee for Democrats. Why not? Everything else this year has been altered. The American people wouldn't have a problem with it, because it's the right thing to do. If she comes out on top, so be it. But if she is defeated by fellow Democrats, then she has to go back to the drawing board, and the nominee is someone else, based on the democratic tradition of selecting the nominee. But that's wishful thinking. Who are we to wish for democracy, right?
I agree. There's nowhere for Harris to run in regards to policy in the debate against Trump. I think the American people will see that old Joe was just grandpa spending time with his misfit grandchildren, and he was too sedated to care. They're burning down the Democratic House, and Grandpa Joe is just along for the ride. It makes him feel young again, witnessing the mayhem the misfits have caused, and Harris is one of those grandchildren. This is why the mainstream media is trying to clean her slate, because she will be challenged on the same issues old Joe was, and we know how that ended. She may be more quick on her feet, but if Tulsi Gabbard exposed her, and that was a fellow Democrat at the time, what do you think the orange puppet will do as her fierce political opponent? They've done more for illegal immigrants than actual American citizens. So Kamala Harris is a product of those policies and views. There is nothing in her rhetoric, her political speeches, that says black support. Sure, black women and women's rights, but nothing about black men who she needs to reach out to as they're rapidly moving to the right. And she knows this, yet what would be her pitch to black men to support her? What can she promise them? Equity? Yeah, okay. For that matter, what can Harris offer other groups such as Hispanics, Mexican Americans, any citizen in this country after the last 3.5 years of financial hardships? Advocating for women's right to abortions is not enough, but that's pretty much the only thing that stands out. And that's not as favorable as many think in society. Honestly, it actually favors Trump, because a lot of people who support women's right to abort are more in that gray area. They don't firmly support it yet, they don't firmly condemn it neither. Based on policy, this aligns more with Trump. His personal views are different, of course, but compromise is the essence of being a strong politician and leader. Here's my take on this issue. Their rear ends have a huge bite mark on them, because this will all come back to bite them in the ass. Harris has to provide what her policies will be, and it won't be different from the radicals, which Trump has already exposed. It's a double-edged sword for Harris, as some have mentioned in mainstream media. If she attempts to disavow her previous policy proposals, she will look unauthentic and trying to convince the American people her views have changed. If she stands firm on those proposals, she will be obliterated. Either she is an opportunist following the currents and how they flow, or she's the same liberal senator who carried that liberal persona with her as vice president. And the devastating issue for Harris is, in fact, she was the vice president. It would be different if she hadn't been the vice president. There may be a benefit of the doubt, but she was already the vice president, so it's like there's nothing she can truly do to change her image. Old Joe signed executive orders to include illegal immigrants on the United States Census. Sure, fine. The vice president stood right by his side, didn't veto the bill, and questioned the impact that will have socioeconomically and politically. No worries. And all the other executive orders he signed in regards to immigration, Harris stood right beside him, because it was her liberal policies and influence, along with the wackos in the party, that actually produced those bills. She was in favor of, and still is in favor of, sanctuary cities, where legal and illegal immigrants reside. Obviously, the negative side of that has produced very brutal crimes against citizens and even other illegal immigrants. Harris was given the role as the border czar. She not only failed, but showed she had no concern for the lives that were lost and the criminal activity along those borders. So she literally is a key component for the policies of the Biden administration. Old Joe was just drugged up and told to sign whatever was thrown on his desk. Sad but true. And see, Trump knows that he wasn't in charge. And when you factor in that Harris was rated the most liberal senator in 2020, it proves that Old Joe was not the one pushing those policies. It was individuals like Harris behind closed doors. It's almost a case of her being exposed. That's why there's this quote, shedding of skin of Harris's past, which is still being implemented in this administration she's a part of, that she contributed to. How do you wiggle out of that one? You can't on the debate stage. The American people already have her profile. It's already been confirmed. There's nothing new to her image, nor her policies. Because if she tries to, quote, calibrate those policies, then Trump will pounce all over it and expose her for being a flip-flopper. And that would happen on a national stage against one of the craziest debaters in political history. On that national and even global stage, Harris will be slated a far-left liberal. No matter how she tries to stay cool and calm, it's her policies that will make her look crazy. Trump won't have anything to do with that. Her record will speak for itself. Well, it's what was pushed. Black women wanted Old Joe to sneak her into this position in his administration. Now we're going to see what happens when the lights are turned on, catching that person being snuck in. Might end up with this look. This is the chaos sector.